This is Josh Mandel with a video that's going to do kind of a tour of some of the available tools and techniques for working with large language models in generating content. And my bread and butter work is with clinical informatics, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to use some simple examples of generating different sorts of quizzes. It should be simple enough that anybody can understand the domain, and it gives us enough interactions, enough opportunities to look at some complexities that I think it'll be a pretty rich place to start. So I'm going to take a historical perspective and begin with the OpenAI Playground. This is a tool that's been around for years. It predates the world of ChatGPT, and in particular, the completions API mode provides access to models that do text completions. What that means is you can paste in or type in some text here, and you can ask the model to complete the text that you've pasted in. And you'll quickly start to learn that there are some techniques to help shape the model's responses. So maybe I'm just going to ask it to tell me what the best fruit is, apples or bananas, and I'm going to ask it to pick just one. And I get out an answer like, this is subjective and depends on personal preference, which is certainly true. I can't really fault the model for choosing this, but it's not what I wanted. So I might think about giving a more specific prompt that will get the model to do what I'm asking for. And so with a completions API, I can do something like prefix the completion with the word answer. My choice is open quote. And when I create a prefix like this, I'm much more likely to get an answer that is sort of what I had in mind, a word in quotes. Great, I got the word apples. Will the model always tell me apples, or is it sometimes going to choose bananas? One way to answer that question is to just hit refresh a few times and draw new samples. Another thing I can do is use some of the controls in the right-hand panel here. For example, setting up the temperature to a higher value. And this is going to cause the model to use more randomness in its selection of the completion. In particular, the model has a probability distribution of what all the next tokens could be. And this temperature is going to make the model more likely to draw from less probable completions. And so by setting up the temperature, I'll get a bit more of a random response. Let's see. It still is pretty much just telling me apples. If you were looking closely, you'll notice that was capital A apples once, and it's a lowercase a apples other times. What's going on here? Well, one thing we can do is we can use these controls to ask for a probability spectrum. And what this does when we have probabilities turned on in the completions API is we can ask the model for any given word that it output, what else was it considering? And so here's the probabilities table. 82% likely to output apples with a little a. The next most likely completion was apples with a capital A. That accounts for the vast majority of probabilities. And then it was not really considering bananas very much, but it was considering bananas at almost the 1% level. So that tells you something about the model's internal preferences, but this is also just a very powerful tool for being able to inspect the model's choices. So this is the completions API, and it gives you access to, or you can use with the completions API, some of the older models. They're not as capable as things like GPT-4. And if you want to use GPT-4, the only API through which it's available and the only interactions through which it's available is something called a chat interaction or a chat API. So I'm going to start off by showing you what that looks like in the ChatGPT tool. Before we go there, let me just show sort of one other detail of the playground, which is this concept of saving your work. If you've developed a prompt that's working really well for you, maybe you've figured out a really great set of guidance for how to get the model to output a really excellent quiz about fruits, you can save your work as a kind of template, and you can come back to it later, or you can share it with a friend or a colleague who might want to build on top of your work. So that's a really powerful capability of the playground for the completions API. So now let's look at the chat API and let's look at what makes it different. The sort of chat interface was first introduced through ChatGPT. And again, if you're interested in a really thoughtful and more powerful model, you'll definitely want to check out GPT-4. It does a much better job reasoning over complex data. But for this demo, we're just going to use GPT 3.5 so we can do kind of an apples-to-apples comparison in our fruit quiz. But in this case, let's just ask it something similar to what we did in the chat, in the completions API. This time, it's going to be in the form of a chat. So I'm the user. I'm typing into this chat box. And each time I type in some message, the model is going to respond with its own message. And we just have kind of a threaded conversation. First me, then OpenAI, which is called the assistant, and then back to me. It could be my turn. I might say something like, I didn't really want 10 questions. I only want 3 questions, please. If I didn't like the output, I can give it that kind of feedback. And now it'll give me a 3-question quiz. So one way that I can refine the output is just through this iterative conversation, asking for corrections. But you'll find that in this example, we got this question here about a fruit named for its yellow color and curved shape. That was sort of the same question that I got back up here. The model is being influenced by its previous conversation turns. And sometimes, even if I ask it to do something different, it will take its previous words as a kind of truth. Sometimes it'll be overly inspired by what it has said in the past. And there are a few ways around this with the chat interface here. One thing you could do is just start a new conversation entirely from scratch. Another thing you can do is go earlier up in the conversation and make a change to a previous message. So maybe I say, I would like 3 questions, please, none about color. And then we'll see if that gives me a different kind of output. So in this case, I'm getting questions that have to do with potassium and with the texture of the fruit and with the foods you can cook from them. But what is really happening here is I have not just a linear conversation, but a tree of conversation. And I can flip through these nodes of the tree and explore my history by clicking through them one or the other. So through this kind of interaction, you can really do some open-ended exploration. It's a great way to get a sense of the capabilities of the model, and it feels very dynamic. You can easily explore a lot of ideas, and you can figure out when do you want to keep the conversation going versus when do you want to go backwards and change something in the history. And those are both really useful techniques. Another feature, if you want to collaborate with peers here, is you can share a link to this conversation. And if you send this to a collaborator, they'll be able to open the link inside of their own window with their own ChatGPT account, and they'll be able to take this conversation and extend it from where you left off. So it's not an interactive collaboration mode, but it still can be a really helpful thing if you're working on content generation and you want different people on your team to be able to generate content alongside you using similar techniques. You can kind of share your prompts or share your conversational history in order to allow your collaborators to complete on top of your work. One thing you can't quite do, though, with this interface is change the behavior of the model. So let's think about what that really means with an example in the playground that should make it a little bit clearer. Let's say we're working with now the chat playground, which has a little bit of a different layout. Here in the chat playground, rather than just completing a single text box, there's a few things going on. First of all, there's a system prompt, which tells the model kind of how to behave. And GPT 3.5 was not trained in a way that it respects the system prompt terribly much. So sometimes it's more effective to write this kind of information in what's called a user message. But GPT-4 pays a lot more attention to the system prompt. But anyway, there's a system prompt that you can use. And then the API call also includes a history of conversation turns where the user and the assistant both might have said something in this history. And the interesting thing that you can do here that you can't do in the ChatGPT web interface is you can sort of pretend that a conversation happened even though the model never really generated it. So maybe I want to say, please generate a quiz about veggies. And I want to tell the model, hey, here's what the assistant said in the past when it was asked to do this task of generating a quiz about veggies. And this can give the model an example of how it, quote unquote, behaved, or how it's perhaps expected to behave. Let's just say, so I don't know what the model's going to do with a history like this, but now I'm going to ask it to generate a quiz about fruits. And then instead of adding another message here, I'm going to allow the assistant to take the next turn in this dialogue. So let's just see what we get. I've still got my temperature kind of cranked up from earlier. I'm just going to submit that and we'll see what we get out. So a few questions about fruits, variety of formats. They don't seem to be particularly influenced by the question in the past here, but we can at least prove that those questions in the past are still visible to the model. Help if I could spell analogous, but the model doesn't mind too much about typos. And so in this case, it's going to focus on some fruits, maybe like tomatoes or vegetables that could be red in color. And what's happening here is that the model is given a history of conversation, and it's being asked to take the next turn. We don't get some of the capabilities to inspect things like token probabilities in this chat API. We only get to generate a single conversation turn. And we also don't get to force the model into taking prefixes. So if you'll recall in our example from the completions API, we were sometimes able to use tricks like answer colon open quote to force the model to start off at a very particular point in the conversation. But with the chats API, we can't quite do that because all we can pass in is complete dialogue turns. You can't give it a partial turn and ask it to extend that partial turn. So you'll have to become accustomed to these kinds of limitations, but also the capability to show it a history of previous dialogue. There's interesting things that become possible there in terms of saving your state. But speaking of actually saving and sharing your state, you'll notice that this box at the top of the screen is grayed out right now. And that's because the OpenAI Playground doesn't yet allow chat completions to be shared. If I'm on the completions page, these options are all available. But if I'm in chat mode, they just haven't implemented support for sharing chat histories yet. Hopefully that'll change soon. But on that front, I want to give you a quick view of a related but different tool, which is the Azure AI Studio Playground. It offers some very similar capabilities to what we've been looking at in the OpenAI Playground. And in particular, it has a chat and a completions API Playground endpoint. And the chat API endpoint has some very similar kinds of functionality where you can provide a system message and you can provide a history of dialogue turns to serve as the basis of your completion. So maybe I'm going to give it a system message like this, and then I'm going to give it a history of dialogue turns, which this tool calls examples. And so maybe I'm going to show it. Yes. I'm going to show it a history like this. And in this case, I can then say, that's all the examples I want to add. Now I'm going to scroll down and ask it to take a turn in the dialogue. So I'm going to do a very similar engagement here. And then when I click complete, it's going to go ahead and generate the next turn in this chat dialogue based on the historical examples and based on the system prompt above. So this is a tool that offers some similar capabilities. It also offers the ability to save your state. So if you want to work with a colleague on kind of a chat history, you can click this export setup button and then share a JSON file with a colleague who can then import it into their own copy of this Playground environment and then pick up from where you left off. So that can be a powerful way to work if you've got a well-designed prompt and you've got some in-context examples that you want to include in your dialogue. Now, across everything we've looked at so far, there are still some challenges. There are still some places where really doing this in a repeatable way might take a lot of time or manual effort. So for example, if I wanted to generate many different quizzes about many different topics, I would have to come in here and maybe first I want to ask it to generate a quiz. And then once it generates the quiz, I might want to then say, that's great. Now generate an answer key. And the model will generate an answer key. And I can say, thanks. Maybe the user wants to take the quiz and have it graded. So I might copy this answer key from the chat. And maybe then I would start a new chat where the user could submit answers to this quiz. And we could give this a shot. I could clear my chat history, I could paste in the quiz, and I could type in some user answers and then get the model to grade that. But it's a lot of back and forth manual work. And if what I want to do is be able to generate lots of quizzes or make these quizzes available for different kinds of folks to fill out, it might be helpful to be able to automate some of this with software tools. So what I have open here is a tool called Jupyter Notebook. And this is an open source tool for working with, in this case, Python code, but also many other programming languages right inside the browser. and you get these units that are called cells that could have a little bit of code in them, and you can execute this code by going into a cell and hitting Control-Enter or hitting this Run button here. And in this case, I'm using a Python library called Guidance, which allows for automation of calls to OpenAI endpoints. I'm going to create a little template. And this is where we're going to get sort of meta. Rather than just asking the model to create a quiz, I'm creating a template that asks the model to create a quiz. And it's got all my details saved here in a way that's easy to edit and also can be checked into version control and shared and reproduced very directly. So in this case, I've got this function called createQuiz, which is going to be a templated interaction with the model, where first we provide a system prompt saying that you're a helpful and terse assistant to generate quizzes. And then we're going to pretend that the user asked for a new quiz to be generated on the following topic. But topic itself is a variable. And this is what's going to give us the ability to have reproducible behaviors. Rather than simply hard coding in the details of a quiz, I'm going to allow the user to pass these in as a variable when we go to call this template. The user is also going to be specifying here a certain number of learning objectives that they want, and then asking the model to just output the learning objectives. And now the assistant takes a turn in this dialogue. And the really interesting thing here is the dialogue hasn't happened yet, but this template is telling the software library, call the generation API at this point, ask the model to generate a new variable. We're going to call that variable learning objectives for the rest of our script. And we can pass in model parameters. So maybe we want to set the temperature up pretty high for learning objectives because we want to be a little bit creative about how we select those. And we don't want to have too many, so we could have a cutoff. We'll say maybe the 300 tokens is the most that should be ever devoted to learning objectives. And then we'll just pretend that the user responded to those objectives, even though they haven't been generated yet. And the user is going to say, that's great, now give me a certain number of questions in the short answer quiz. Don't write the answers, just the questions. And then we're going to ask the model to do another generation. We're going to call that variable questions. And in this case, we want the questions to maybe to be less creative, more on point and predictable. And we're going to ask the model to do that generation with those parameters. And then finally, the user will ask the model to output a rubric for scoring. And we're going to save that in a variable called rubric. So that whole template describes a fairly sophisticated process going back and forth in a dialogue to generate 3 different variables that can be refined and used downstream. So let me just run this. Create quiz is not defined. So I made a little error. I told you that each cell of this notebook can be executed, but I didn't execute this cell. So let me just go ahead and fix that. And now my template is actually defined in my Python script, and I can move down to call it. So in this case, I'm going to ask the template, when I run it, I'm going to ask it to generate a quiz about common fruits. I'm going to ask it to come up with, let's say, 2 learning objectives and 3 questions, and each question is going to be worth 5 points. So these are my template variables, and I'm going to go ahead and run this one again. Now in the output, you're going to see there's some text which is just black on a white background. This is the text that was provided by me in my template. It never varies. And then there is some text with a blue background. This is the user inputs, or variables supplied by the user in this case. And then there's text with a green background. And this is what is actually being generated by calls to the model. So the library is managing this back and forth interaction in a pretty sophisticated way. It's calling the model, it's generating some new text based on user inputs, and then it's calling the model again. And you can see there's sort of 3 clusters of green text here. One for the learning objectives, one for the quiz itself, and one for the rubric. And so there were 3 model calls under the hood, and this library orchestrated those, each with a different temperature, each with different parameters, and each with the ability to see the previous conversation details and the user inputs just at the right point. So now we've got this quiz. We've got a couple of learning objectives, and we want to know characteristics of citrus, 3 types of berries, and how to tell a fruit from a vegetable. And then here's a rubric that the model has learned, or has suggested for how to grade these quizzes. So let's say we've done this, and we want to actually try grading a quiz. Now the fair way to do it, I could take the quiz itself and paste it into ChatGPT, and then I could paste the rubric into ChatGPT, and then I could type in some answers from the user and ask for a score. But that's a lot of manual copying and pasting. In this Python script, I've now got nice variables that are acting as handles on each of these parts of the quiz. So I can start a whole new session with the language model, by creating a new template here, which is going to be the grading template. So I had one template for quiz generation. I'm going to have another one for grading. And in this case, I'm going to tell the model that it's a helpful and terse assistant that grades quizzes and provides feedback. And we're going to have a chat turn where the user asks the model to grade a quiz. And we're just going to pass in the quiz from the previous conversation and the answers that will be passed in as part of this template call. And we're going to pass in the rubric from the previous conversation. And then we're going to instruct the model that after generating a score, we'd like it to provide a helpful and constructive bit of feedback for the student. And then finally, we're going to assume there's a dialogue turn here where the assistant generates. And in this case, we're going to call that variable that it generates the report. And we're going to sample with these parameters. OK, now we can actually grade our quiz. We're going to pass in our questions and our rubric from the previous section. And I'm going to now attempt to answer the question. I think there were 3 questions. So characteristics of citrus, 3 types of berries, and fruit versus vegetable. Citrus has a rind. Berries are strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries. And how do you tell a fruit from a vegetable? Fruits are sweet. Let's see how it likes that. So I'm going to go ahead and call the model with those choices. I made the same mistake as previously. I need to actually run this cell so that my quiz is defined. Now I can grade my quiz. OK, so here's the dialogue. You can see, again, these are now the inputs that I've slotted in. The longest inputs are from the previous conversation. I just spliced them right in here. That's the quiz content and the rubric. And this short input here is the one I just typed by hand, simulating what the user might have supplied. And now we can see the model's generation. Based on the provided answers, here's the score breakdown. I got no points on any question. My answer is incorrect and doesn't describe any characteristic of citrus fruit. Well, we could debate this. My answer listed 3 types of berries, but I failed to describe their nutritional values. And my third answer didn't provide any explanation. I didn't provide a good explanation, but I did provide an explanation. OK, well, I got 0 points out of 15. And now here's some constructive feedback that I should really review the learning objectives. But I hope this gives you a sense of how these tools can be used to construct fairly sophisticated workflows where inputs can be from the user. They can also be from external data. And I can weave together different interactions. And this is a little bit subtle, but it's worth saying this second set of model calls doesn't have access to the history from the first set of model calls. It's a totally independent conversation. I chose what bits of information to slot in here, and that was completely under my control by defining these template variables. And so to be able to reproduce this kind of back and forth dialogue by hand would be a lot of copying and pasting in something like a playground environment or a chat environment. And so really having access to these kinds of scripts is a great way to create reproducible and somewhat more complex template-driven workflows. So that's all the formal content that I wanted to share for today. I will, just as a little bonus feature, because I'm curious, paste in this same prompt to ChatGPT, where I can use the GPT-4 model, because I'm wondering whether GPT-4 is going to be any friendlier to me. I was kind of hoping that it would, find at least some value in my answers, which seem to have been totally rejected by GPT 3.5. So let's see. I'm going to just basically paste in more or less this whole flow. Quiz questions, answers, scoring rubric. Let's hear it. So in this case, I got 3 points out of 5 for my citrus characteristics because I was partially correct. I got 3 points out of 5 for my berry types because I did list 3 berries, but I failed to provide nutritional information. And I got no points for describing that fruits are sweet because it's not accurate or sufficient. And so this is actually a really interesting property of GPT-4. What makes it such an interesting and important model is it's got a real sense of judgment and balance. Where GPT 3.5 generated perfectly plausible sounding text, it didn't really grapple with the nuance of the semantics. And GPT-4 is able to do this out of the box. Let's see what feedback I got. Where GPT 3.5 basically just told me to read the question, GPT-4 is really asking me very specific ways to expand my answer. It's praising me on the things I did well, And it's giving me hints, at least, about different ways I could approach this question of differentiating fruits from vegetables. So I hope that gave you kind of an interesting and lighthearted way to think about some of these tools and ways to think about going from open-ended explorations in a chat environment towards reproducible or shareable prompt histories in these kinds of playgrounds, towards more structured and version-controlled applications that you can build for yourself using a programming language like Python and potentially even an interactive environment like Jupyter Notebook.